He appeared in the entryway with a youthful, unburdened air, travel bags hanging from his shoulder. His skin bore a subtle tan from a sunnier place than our neighborhood, and a weary smile failed to completely mask his reluctance to be there. My husband was the first to greet him, a casual acknowledgement, like one might offer a distant coworker. Almost before the front door clicked shut, my husband had already turned back to his laptop. I found myself lingering in the hallway longer than intended, my senses adjusting to an arrival I hadn't braced myself for. They hadn't shared a home since his teenage years, and even those periods were sporadic. I was familiar with the narratives, his reserved quietness, his mother's lingering resentment, the palpable strain that filled any space they occupied simultaneously. Yet, now he was a man. Still reserved, certainly, but with a newfound solidity. His voice had deepened, his stride was more deliberate, more substantial. He moved with the caution of someone accustomed to navigating delicate situations. He settled into the guest room at the far end of the house. It had been unused for months, and I dedicated the morning to tidying it, folding towels, smoothing bed linens with perhaps excessive care. I set an aromatic candle on the bureau, only to retrieve it 5 minutes later, deeming it overly intimate. During dinner, my husband predominantly conversed with himself, discussing figures, operational details, and disruptions in the supply chain. I mechanically pushed food around my plate, offering nods when appropriate, my thoughts elsewhere. Across from us, the young man was attentive. He contributed little to the conversation, but when he did speak, his words were directed at me. They were light inquiries, neutral remarks, yet his gaze, unlike his father's, remained steady, focused. That evening, I found myself wearing a dressing gown I hadn't chosen in some time. It was a silky, pale gray, clinging to the contours of my back. I rationalized it as a choice for comfort. I avoided the mirror, there was no need to look. Barefoot, I walked into the corridor to get more water, the silence around me dense and unbroken. I hadn't anticipated encountering him. He was standing near the kitchen, sipping from a tumbler, clad only in sweatpants, his hair still damp from a recent shower. He saw me, not a fleeting glance, not a mere noticing, he truly saw me, so I didn't recoil. Nor did I avert my gaze. We moved past one another without exchanging a word, yet my heartbeat resonated in my ears like a muffled drum, a quiet, unhurried alert that didn't resemble fear. That night, I lay in our bed next to a man who made no move to touch me. He never did anymore. It wasn't an act of unkindness, he had simply ceased to see the value in it. We had become, I suppose, companions, civil, at ease, secure. For a very long time, I had persuaded myself that this was adequate. Recently, however, my body yearned for something beyond simple warmth. It longed for the sharp thrill of immediacy, the sensation of fingers tugging at material, the breathless intensity of being wanted. I had lost touch with the vocabulary of unspoken electricity. The quiet at the dining table had introduced its first new term. The following morning, he was already seated at the kitchen table when I descended. A coffee cup sat before him, one earphone in. I poured my own cup and took a seat opposite him. My husband had departed early for a meeting. The room was still, save for the low hum of the refrigerator. He glanced up, only for a moment. "Didn't intend to startle you last night," he commented. "You didn't?" I responded, a little too hastily. A slight smile touched his lips, the sort that doesn't quite reach the eyes but hovers at the corner of the mouth, as if it has a destination in mind but is in no particular hurry to get there. Later that day, I changed the linens in his room. Not because it was necessary. Simply because I felt an urge to connect with the space he occupied. I introduced a small lamp, rearranged the unread books on his shelf. It's a peculiar act, tending to someone you're meant to keep out of your thoughts. But I had learned long ago that care often flourishes in places where words dare not venture. That evening, I found myself drawn to the kitchen once more. Not driven by hunger, not truly. I was simply waiting. I detested how time seemed to decelerate when I awaited his arrival. And still, I remained. When he came in, he propped himself against the counter and inquired, "Is this house always so silent?" "It used to feel peaceful," I replied. "Lately, it feels more emphasized." Emphasized, as if something significant was on the verge of being articulated, but no one possessed the courage to voice it. He didn't respond immediately. Then, "I believe people communicate a great deal without uttering a sound." I concurred with a nod. I sensed his gaze on me again. Not on my face, but on the way my fingers cradled the stem of the wineglass, the unhurried manner of my exhalation. He wasn't engaging in flirtation. That's what amplified the discomfort. He was observing. That night, I opted for different lingerie. Not in anticipation of anything, but purely for myself. A burgundy lace, soft against the skin. I studied my reflection in the mirror for longer than was strictly necessary. It wasn't self-admiration. It was a craving. Not for compliments, but for acknowledgement. For recognition. Lying beside my husband, the expanse between our bodies felt like a vast sea. His breathing was even, content, mine was deliberate, restrained. I turned onto my side and murmured, "Can you recall the last occasion you touched me without it being a mere reflex?" He remained still. Perhaps asleep, perhaps feigning it. My phone illuminated, a message from the young man. "Thanks for the wine, and the analogy." I gazed at the screen. I didn't reply, but I didn't erase it either. The ensuing days drifted by with a misleading calm, the kind of quiet that blankets a scene just before a downpour. We navigated the house like well-rehearsed acquaintances. Civil nods in the morning, brief conversations in the kitchen, the infrequent intersection of our paths in the hallway. Yet, beneath this serene facade, something was slowly unraveling. I perceived it in the way my breath hitched when I registered his footsteps on the staircase, and how my hands lingered excessively on the towel he'd left in the bathroom. Nothing had transpired. Not in the conventional sense, not yet. But everything had commenced. My husband continued to be engrossed in his established pattern. Meetings, telephone conversations, dinner consumed in front of the television. I had ceased trying to vie with that cadence. I had learned over time that absence doesn't invariably clamor for attention. Sometimes, it merely hums softly in the periphery of your existence until you mistake its sound for true silence. That Saturday, he departed early for a corporate retreat. 2 nights, possibly 3. He pecked my cheek as he left, his lips grazing my skin like fine paper. I didn't inquire about his return, he offered no information. The house felt altered in his absence. Not more liberating, just quieter in a manner that made no pretense of being soothing. I poured coffee in the kitchen, attired in a flimsy cotton blouse, braless. The weather was warm, but my actions were deliberate. I could feel the air against my skin, the material brushing me as I moved. It wasn't about allure, not on a conscious level. It was about sensation, about reclaiming a part of myself that had lain dormant. He entered, barefoot, his hair damp once more, rubbing his neck with a towel. Our eyes met and held for a fraction too long, both of us acknowledging the peculiar closeness that had. He poured himself coffee without a word and leaned against the counter. Noticing the sunlight streaming through the window, I mentioned needing assistance to bring down the remaining storage containers from the highest shelf in the garage. He accompanied me there. No inquiries made. The garage was thick with the scent of dust and neglect. I indicated the top shelf, and he ascended the stepladder. Without a second thought, I secured its base, feigning ignorance of the contour of his waist as his shirt rode up. He passed down a plastic bin and started to descend, but he miscalculated. The final step, and he faltered somewhat, his hand landing on my shoulder to steady himself. His hand was warm, solid. It lingered longer than required. He offered a quiet apology, his palm still resting against me, his fingers brushing the material of my blouse. I offered no reply. My body had already responded for me. We carried the container inside and placed it near the hallway. My gratitude was overly formal, uttered too swiftly. He nodded but did not depart. He stood in the living room entrance, arms folded, observing as I opened the bin and began to extract old books and wires. "Do you require assistance organizing this?" he inquired. "No," I stated, but my voice lacked conviction. He remained stationary. Then I voiced it, not looking at him, not looking at anything in particular. "Actually, yes. Could you perhaps stay a bit longer?" He settled beside me on the carpet, the container positioned between us. We feigned sorting through the contents for a period. A collection of paperbacks, jumbled extension cords. Picture frames I hadn't laid eyes on in years. One held a graduation photograph of my husband. I gazed at it for a moment, then turned it face down. I only registered his proximity when I shifted slightly, and our shoulders made contact. Neither of us recoiled. I could perceive the warmth radiating from his skin, the steady cadence of his breath. My fingers quivered almost imperceptibly as I picked up a cord, attempting to disentangle it. He reached across, gently taking it from my grasp. His hand brushed against mine. Still, no words were exchanged. Only breath, then, barely a whisper. "Your hands are chilly." I turned my head towards him. His gaze did not waver. He inclined forward. And this time, I didn't become immobile. I didn't weigh the potential consequences, the moral implications, or the gravity of the betrayal. I simply moved in his direction. His lips found mine with a sense of rediscovery, not newness. The kiss wasn't tentative, nor was it aggressive. It was complete, unhurried, the kind that makes your knees momentarily forget their purpose. His hand glided around my waist, gentle yet firm. My own fingers found the nape of his neck, the damp tendrils of hair still present there. I didn't resist it. I had no desire to. After a duration that felt like an entire change of seasons condensed into a single exhalation, we separated. Neither of us uttered a sound. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was substantial, pregnant with all the sentiments we weren't yet prepared to articulate. He was the first to rise, slowly. His eyes rested on me for a moment, as if posing an unvoiced question. "I'll allow you to finish," he stated, his voice subdued. Neutral. Excessively neutral. And then he ascended the stairs, the sound of his door closing more softly than the blood thudding in my ears. I remained on the floor. I didn't stir for a considerable time. My lips still felt a faint tingling. My skin felt overly taut. I wasn't ashamed. That was the most unsettling aspect. I wasn't anything, not shattered, not joyful, not torn. I was simply aware. Later, I stood in the bathroom, observing my reflection. My cheeks were heated. A small trace of mascara smudged beneath one eye. My collarbone showed a redness where his thumb had lingered. I touched it softly, the sensation of his hand resonating beneath my skin. I considered sending him a text. A single word. "Come." Or perhaps nothing. Just a symbol of inquiry. Instead, I showered, taking my time, selecting fresh undergarments, black lace, soft and yielding. Not for anyone else. For the woman in the reflection, who had at last recalled the sensation of being truly seen. I lay in bed that night, sleepless for hours. The stillness didn't frighten me. The recollection of his mouth did. Not because a boundary had been breached, but because I instinctively knew it wouldn't be the final instance. I avoided my reflection the next morning, not from a sense of wrongdoing. There was none, or at least, not yet. What I experienced was closer to a feeling of precariousness, like traversing a frozen pond and hearing the initial, ominous crack beneath your soles. I still possessed the opportunity to retreat, but a part of me resisted the idea. He was already present in the kitchen when I came downstairs. His hair was untidy, his t-shirt loose and creased. He appeared fatigued, yet there was an incisiveness in his gaze when he saw me, a look of acknowledgement. I poured my coffee deliberately, conscious of the quiet, the weighty understanding of what had transpired between us. We didn't converse. Not at that moment. We merely exchanged fleeting, almost businesslike glances, as if pretending nothing untoward had occurred on the floor beside that storage container. And yet, a definite shift had taken place. It wasn't solely memory that caused a warmth to spread through my palms when he passed by me. It was the profound realization that we had already surmounted a barrier, and nothing on the other side would ever feel the same. Later in the day, my husband came back. His voice once again permeated the house, like indistinct background noise. He kissed my forehead. I offered a smile, as it was anticipated. He unpacked, providing the usual narration, the traffic, the state of the weather, the subpar food. I nodded and posed all the appropriate inquiries. I didn't meet his gaze for extended periods during dinner. I arranged the table for 3. The dinnerware was set out meticulously, as always. He occupied his customary seat, phone nearby, scrolling through it between mouthfuls. I inquired about a document he had neglected to sign the previous week. He responded with a vague sound. Across from me, the young man sat more upright, his fork still in hand. He was observing me again, not overtly, but with focused attention. Beneath the table, our feet nearly made contact. I shifted mine subtly, just a fraction of an inch nearer. It wasn't premeditated, I simply didn't retract it. When our knees brushed, I didn't react. I didn't look upwards. I merely registered the warmth of that touch, like a caution and a pledge combined. My husband, entirely unaware, was reciting headlines aloud, something concerning a bank consolidation. His voice faded into an indistinct murmur. I excused myself early, citing a headache. My body felt no pain, but an internal sensation pulsed, deep, preoccupied, restless. Upstairs, I changed into my nightclothes slowly. A loose-fitting tank top, no bra, and the identical black lace underneath. I didn't plan for him to see, but a part of me was preparing, just in case. I didn't achieve sleep. I lay conscious, gazing at the ceiling, straining to hear footsteps. None came. In the morning, my husband departed early for his workplace. I feigned sleep when he brushed his lips against my cheek. His lips were parched, perfunctory. I waited until I heard the car recede from the driveway. Then I arose and prepared coffee. He was already in the main living area, reclining on the sofa with a book he clearly wasn't engrossed in. I paused at the doorway, then entered and placed a mug beside him. "Thanks," he uttered, simple, neutral, as if the atmosphere between us hadn't been charged for 3 days. "I'm going for a stroll later," I announced, "by the lake." "Alone?" he inquired, without raising his eyes. "I suppose." He closed the book but offered no reply. I exited the room. By the time I arrived at the path near the lake, the sky had transitioned to a soft, muted blue, the kind of illumination that mellows everything, even one's thoughts. I wore a thin cardigan over a camisole, snug jeans, and flat shoes, all practical, all chosen with intent. The gravel crunched beneath my feet, harmonizing with my breathing. I felt myself exhale more freely here, amongst trees that posed no questions. I required this walk, not for physical exertion, but for separation, to extend the distance between what had occurred and what might yet unfold. I didn't register his footsteps behind me. I only became aware of him when I turned and discovered him there, hands tucked into his pockets, his expression inscrutable. "You followed me?" I questioned. "Yes," he affirmed. "I didn't intend to." That elicited a laugh from me, a dry, somewhat acerbic sound that wasn't quite mirth. "Then for what reason did you?" "I'm not sure," he confessed. "But I'm present." We settled onto a bench near the water's edge. The trees swayed above us, their branches rubbing together like fragile, whispered confidences. I gazed at the lake's surface. It remained placid, undisturbed, offering no reflection. "I shouldn't be thinking about you," I stated softly. "I'm aware." I turned my head and looked at him. "But you are." He didn't refute it. "It's not solely physical." "Don't be dishonest with me," I retorted, my tone sharper than intended. "Of course, it's physical." "It is, but not exclusively." The quiet between us felt like a delicate sheet of glass, breakable, hazardous. Then he extended his hand, merely resting it near mine on the bench. Not making contact, just poised. I remained still. I uttered no words. I allowed the space between our fingers to smolder like a lit fuse. Later that evening, back in the house, I was reserved. I prepared supper, washed the cutlery. I responded to my husband's inquiries with gentle, effective replies. He failed to perceive the alteration. Or perhaps he did, and opted not to inquire. Occasionally, silence is a response individuals accept because they are too fatigued to contend. In bed, I lay motionless while he read beside me. The illumination from his tablet cast a faint sheen on his face. He didn't touch me. I didn't touch him. When he extinguished the light and turned away, I stared at the ceiling and whispered something I didn't intend for anyone to overhear. Not a declaration of guilt, not a feeling of remorse, a name, not his. I drifted to sleep with my heart thudding against the confines of my ribs, like a living entity that had just recalled its capacity for movement. I began to perceive time through a different lens. Not in terms of days or hours or established patterns, but in fleeting looks, in the significance of unspoken sentiments exchanged across a corridor, in the duration it took for his fingers to brush mine as we passed one another. Everything decelerated and gained a sharper focus. The most insignificant instances now felt like heavily charged actions. And what unnerved me wasn't the swiftness with which it had transpired. It was how silently I had permitted its entry. The undercurrent wasn't dramatic, it wasn't imbued with dramatic pronouncements or stirring music. It was understated, almost courteous, yet it insinuated itself into every facet of existence, into the way I'd touch my neck when he entered a space, into the manner he'd pause for me to speak before he departed. There was no premeditated strategy, no calculated play, just a gradual, irrefutable pull. That week, my husband had proposed I take some time away from the house. Go somewhere, get some fresh air. "You've seemed on edge lately," he'd remarked, without diverting his gaze from his laptop. I couldn't ascertain if his suggestion stemmed from concern, guilt, or simple indifference, but the proposition felt like a slightly open door. I might visit the museum, I informed him. A calm day to collect my thoughts. What I omitted telling him was that I had invited someone to join me. It wasn't presented as a romantic outing. I didn't dress for one. A beige pullover, well-fitting jeans, subtle makeup, hair worn loose, casual, unremarkable. But beneath it all, I wore a navy silk bra and coordinating underwear. A detail only I would be privy to. That clandestine layer beneath the ordinary facade of everything else. He met me outside the museum. His shirt was a dark color, sleeves pushed up. He offered a brief, genuine smile upon seeing me, without attempting to assign any particular meaning to it. We didn't make physical contact. We didn't converse much either. The nature of the silence between us had transformed, less strained, more cognizant. Inside, we ambled unhurriedly through the exhibition halls, each successive room cooler and more hushed than the one before. The displays themselves were inconsequential, I scarcely registered them. I observed the way his gaze followed the lines of paintings, the way he stood a little too near yet refrained from touching. I noted how he inclined his head when I spoke softly and how his smile didn't reveal his teeth. We lingered before a sculpture for an extended period. It was an abstract piece, bronze and flowing, almost anthropomorphic. I focused on it because I didn't trust myself to look directly at him. "I used to visit here often," I mentioned. "Alone." "Always." He nodded. I didn't ask if he grasped my underlying meaning. I believe he did. When we departed, the sky had altered. It was that mid-afternoon gray that diffuses the light, making everything feel like the interior of a tranquil room. We walked towards the parking structure without speaking. Before unlocking my vehicle, I hesitated. He was positioned behind me, close enough for me to sense his nearness, though not his breath. I turned to face him slowly. "Do you have regrets?" I inquired, without clarifying that, as it wasn't necessary. "No," he stated firmly. "Do you?" I offered no response. We stood there in the concrete stillness of the parking building, the sound of tires reverberating from somewhere far below. I leaned back against the car's side, the metal cool through my sweater. He took a single step forward, the intervening space vanished. He looked at my mouth, not with haste, but with something akin to recollection. "Are you going to kiss me again?" I asked. "No," he replied. "Not in this place." I despised the intensity of my wish that he were being untruthful. Back at the house, the quietude returned, as if it were an obligation. My husband was in the kitchen, pouring wine. He greeted me in the manner one greets someone who has been engaged in an inconsequential activity. I inquired about his day. He recounted details about a new business associate. We sat on the sofa and watched the evening news. His hand came to rest on my knee. I endeavored not to recoil. Later that evening, he retired to bed early. It was an infrequent occurrence. His hand brushed against my hip beneath the bedclothes. I didn't pull away. Nor did I move nearer. He leaned over and kissed my shoulder. His breath was warm. "I've missed this," he murmured. I closed my eyes. I permitted him to kiss me, to touch me. Yet my thoughts were distant, dwelling on the contour of another's hand, on the resonance of a silent museum chamber, on bronze that resembled human skin. When he was finished, he rolled onto his side and whispered, "You've been rather withdrawn lately." I paused, then replied, "Just fatigued." I could sense him observing me in the dimness, but he posed no further questions. Perhaps because he was reluctant to hear what might follow. The next morning, I awoke earlier than my usual time. I took a more leisurely shower, attended to shaving, and applied lotion to my skin. I selected my softest underthings, black mesh, low-cut, intentionally fragile, then jeans, a white blouse, and a gray blazer. Nothing overtly suggestive on the exterior, but inwardly, I felt like an ignited match. He was in the living area again, this time idly scrolling on his phone. I mentioned needing assistance with something upstairs, in the storage closet. He followed me without a word. Upstairs, the hallway was dimly lit. I opened the closet door slowly, feigning a search for something. He stood behind me, close enough that his chest made contact with my shoulder. "Did you locate it?" he inquired. "No," I replied. He remained still. I turned slightly, still oriented towards the open closet, and stated, "Sometimes I feign that everything is perfectly fine." He offered no response. "But I'm weary of pretending," I added, my voice softer now. His hand came to rest on the side of the closet door, just above mine. His thumb moved once, brushing the edge of my wrist. It wasn't a grasp, it wasn't even particularly forward, but it was intentional. And I didn't resist it. We didn't exchange a kiss then. We didn't even meet each other's gaze. We simply stood there, the warmth intensifying between us like mounting pressure behind a pane of glass. Neither of us initiated the next move, but we would. And shortly, it commenced with a brief message. Nothing intricate, merely a folded slip of paper placed on the small table in the corridor between our rooms. The script wasn't tidy, it was rapid, almost hesitant, as if uncertain of its own right to exist. "Be home at 2. Don't knock." I perused it 3 times before slipping it into the side pocket of my dressing gown. My hand quivered slightly as I did so, not from apprehension, that particular emotion had long since dissipated, but from the sheer gravity of the anticipation. I felt it constricting my chest with each passing moment. That morning, I maintained appearances. I prepared coffee, responded to a client's call, folded laundry, the mundane routines of diversion. My husband had departed for the day. A last-minute client engagement, he had explained, to be followed by drinks. He wouldn't return until late. His tone over the phone had been sharp, businesslike, and appreciative that I hadn't probed with questions. By midday, I began my preparations. Not in a rushed manner, not like an adolescent engaging in clandestine activities. This wasn't a transgression to be concealed with shame. Not yet. It was a determination I had arrived at long before any message materialized. I showered unhurriedly, attended to all necessary grooming, and dried myself with diligence. When I stood before the mirror, I deliberated over my choice. Not red, that seemed too blatant. Not white, too demure. I selected a deep green. A fragile set with slender straps and high-cut sides that embraced my hips just enough to serve as a reminder of their presence. I donned a long linen skirt over it and a black blouse with a plunging back. No adornments, merely a touch of perfume behind my knees and on my collarbone. I waited in the living room, a book in hand that I wasn't actually reading. The text swam before my eyes. At 1:52, I closed it. At 1:57, I rose. At precisely 2 o'clock, I moved with purpose. I opened his door. He was seated on the bed's edge, as if he had been anticipating my arrival all along. His look wasn't one of expectation, nor was it one of unease. He appeared composed, unwavering, yet when our eyes connected, I perceived that subtle spark, the one that had ignited weeks prior and had not waned since. I secured the door behind me and uttered no words. I approached the window and made a slight adjustment to the drapery, though the illumination was already subdued. My hand paused on the material. I could sense his observation, the rhythm of his breathing behind me like an additional entity in the room. "I didn't imagine you'd actually come," he stated. I turned around slowly. "Then you are unacquainted with me." He remained on the bed. I, too, stayed put. The silence between us was no longer void, it was replete with all the unspoken sentiments, the way my hand had brushed against his in the corridor the previous night. The manner in which we had stood side by side, not touching, not even breathing, simply waiting for something to give way. Now it had. I took a step in his direction, then another. Upon reaching him, I paused, just near enough for my knees to make contact with his. He didn't extend a hand towards me. He waited. The stillness caused my skin to tingle. I leaned down deliberately, hands by my sides. My lips met his, as if this were a familiar act, as if it were no longer a query, but the resolution itself. His mouth felt warm, known, yet utterly distinct from the man I had wed. There was no predictability in it, no sense of duty, only a raw, slow-burning, perilously patient desire. He returned my kiss with a measured control, not from a deficiency of eagerness, but because he understood, on an intuitive level, that the anticipation was integral to what made the moment almost unbearable. My hand glided to his neck, his fingers to the hem of my skirt, pausing just at the upper part of my thigh, advancing no further. That controlled gesture conveyed more than any impulsive clutch ever could. When we finally drew apart, neither of us offered a smile. This wasn't light-hearted, it wasn't a flirtatious exchange. It was an acknowledgement. I sat next to him on the bed. My shoulder brushed against his arm. Our thighs made contact. He turned his head slightly and let out a slow, deliberate breath. "I shouldn't desire this," he stated. It wasn't an objection, it was an admission. "But you do." He didn't reply. There was no need. We remained in that position for a considerable time, our bodies not entwined, but positioned side by side, in alignment. Two individuals who recognized they had crossed a threshold from which there was no retreat, and who, for reasons unknown, felt no compulsion to offer apologies for it. After exiting his room, I didn't return to my own. I proceeded to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water, washed my hands, and wiped down a counter that wasn't soiled. I kept myself in motion. The faint traces of his breath still clung to my skin. I could still perceive the sensation of his mouth on mine when I touched my lips with the back of my hand. I was in the process of returning a dish to the cupboard when the front door swung open. My husband had returned, unexpectedly early. I became motionless. He didn't perceive my stillness. He was speaking about a client canceling their lunch engagement, about congestion on the motorway. I smiled and nodded. I couldn't register a single word. My ears were filled with the sound of my own pulse. "I believe I'll go lie down," I mentioned. "Certainly," he responded. "Is everything all right?" I paused. "Yes, just a slight headache." He kissed my temple and proceeded into the study. I stood isolated in the kitchen, my heart a frantic, throbbing entity against my ribs. Not from culpability, but from the stark comprehension that I had transgressed a boundary that could not be undone. Not in contemplation, not in physicality, not in a single breath. That night, in bed, my husband shifted towards me. He placed a hand on my back and commented, "You've been remarkably quiet recently." I swallowed. "I've simply been reflecting a great deal, about us, about everything." He nodded slowly, as if that explanation sufficed. But it didn't. Not for me. Not any longer. And in the dimness, when his hand drifted lower, I didn't resist. Yet, I also didn't close my eyes, because in my imagination I was in an entirely different place. And that place involved green lace, and warmth, and a silence that held no deceit. The following morning, I awoke with his hand still resting upon my waist. My husband's breath was gentle against my shoulder, unhurried and even. For a brief interval, I simply lay there, utterly still. My eyes adjusted to the faint light seeping through the curtains. I counted the intervals between his inhalations and exhalations, attempting to anchor myself to something familiar, something not slipping away beneath me. A peculiar lucidity resided in my chest, a muted ache that bore no relation to sadness, but was entirely about emotional distance. I was present, in this bed, alongside a man who believed he had just shared an intimate moment with his wife. And I had permitted it. I had performed as anticipated, breathed in unison with him, matched his cadence like a well-rehearsed choreography. But I had experienced nothing. Not warmth, not remorse, not even opposition, merely a void. The presence of someone else occupying all the space where emotion once resided. He shifted slightly and pressed a light kiss to my back before rising from the bed. I registered the sound of his phone being unlocked, his slippers padding on the hardwood floor, the soft click as the bathroom door closed. I remained motionless, eyes open, staring at nothing in particular. I thought about the green lace concealed in the bottom drawer of my dressing table, about the note still neatly folded within my purse, now hidden in the linen closet, about his mouth on mine, the way he hadn't touched me beyond my face and hips, and how that very restraint had kindled a sensation more intense than anything I had ever experienced. I rose. Slowly, I wrapped myself in a robe and descended the stairs. The light in the kitchen was stark, unsparing. I embraced it. I prepared coffee, scrambled eggs, toasted bread, mechanical actions I could perform in my sleep. He came down minutes later, his tie askew, fumbling with the cuff of his sleeve. "You needn't have prepared breakfast," he remarked distractedly. "I wished to." I fibbed, presenting him with a plate. He consumed his meal rapidly, perusing emails, replying between mouthfuls. I sat opposite him, cradling my mug in both hands, nodding when appropriate, offering a smile when expected. He didn't look at me much, he seldom did in the mornings. I used to internalize it. Now, it felt like a form of tacit consent. After he departed for his office, I stood in the hallway for some time, gazing at the closed front door. The silence of the house enveloped me once more, like a familiar garment. I remained motionless for several minutes, simply allowing the quiet to remind me of what I was now capable of. Upstairs, I passed his room, the other one. The door was shut, but I felt no need to open it. Not yet. I could still perceive the phantom touch of yesterday beneath my fingernails. I proceeded to my own room, seated myself at the vanity, and scrutinized my reflection. There were no visible traces, no lipstick stains, no contusions, no telltale signs. Yet, I appeared different. There was a new sharpness in my eyes, something I couldn't conceal even if I desired to. I dressed with deliberation that day, not ostentatiously, but with clear intent. A soft blouse tucked neatly into high-waisted trousers, my hair drawn back, yet loosely enough to appear unstudied. No lipstick, merely a hint of gloss. I applied perfume again. This time, the one he had once remarked smelled like the heart of a forest. It was no longer about enticement. It was about preparedness. I spent the afternoon in the garden, extricating weeds that didn't require removal, snipping flowers that had only just unfurled. I wasn't engaged in thought, not in a verbal sense, my actions were purely mechanical. It provided a measure of solace. When I returned indoors, he was at the sink, drinking a glass of water. We hadn't exchanged words all day. His presence in the kitchen wasn't unforeseen, yet it still elicited a subtle, immediate stirring within me. "You were outside for a considerable time," he observed. "I required the fresh air." He nodded, refraining from further inquiry. I turned to wash my hands, standing beside him, the water cascading between my fingers. I could sense his gaze upon me, but he offered no further words. And neither did I. That evening, my husband returned home in an unusually communicative state. A particular meeting had evidently concluded favorably. He uncorked a bottle of wine, poured substantial amounts, and insisted we dine together in the dining room for a change, rather than in front of the television. I complied. I was amiable. I posed questions. I smiled at all the appropriate junctures. But beneath the surface, my thoughts were entirely elsewhere. He discussed intentions for a brief weekend excursion. "Just the two of us," he stated. "Escape the house, visit the coast, walk along the beach. We require that." I concurred. Or, at the very least, I didn't voice dissent. After dinner, he reached for my hand as we cleared the dishes. His thumb brushed against the inner part of my wrist. The gesture was tender, familiar, and yet it felt as though I were being touched by an unfamiliar person. A warm, well-intentioned, unfamiliar person. Later that night, we lay in bed once more. He touched me. I permitted it, but it felt like adhering to someone else's prescribed movements. I moved in cadence. I moaned softly. I closed my eyes, but all I could perceive was the intervening space, between who I was and who I had transformed into, between the hands upon my body and those I yearned for. When he finally succumbed to sleep, I remained conscious. I gazed at the ceiling again, listening to the drone of the fan, the sporadic creak of the floorboards. My skin felt alien, my chest overly constricted. My mind refused to settle. I arose, enveloped myself in a blanket, and descended the stairs. I sat on the living room sofa, curled into myself, staring out the window at the obscurity beyond the yard. I wasn't contemplating what I had done. I was considering what I desired next. Not an escape, not solace, merely authenticity, in whatever guise it might demand. Footsteps approached from behind, slow, deliberate. I didn't turn. He sat beside me, in silence. Neither of us spoke. There was no need. The room was dark, but something within it had begun to emanate a faint light. The proposition arrived from my husband, quite unexpectedly. A weekend in the countryside. He had reserved a small rental cottage, the type with an abundance of wood and a scarcity of mobile signal, believing it would be beneficial for us. It'll refresh our minds, he declared over breakfast, smiling like someone still persuaded there was something salvageable. I nodded in agreement. I posed no inquiries. He then suggested we extend the invitation to his son. It might be advantageous for all of us, he added, his tone almost circumspect. And I understood in that instant that he perceived something. Perhaps not the entirety of it, not the precise nature of what had begun to develop between his wife and his son, but enough to sense the subtle alterations in the room's atmosphere, the pauses between glances, the current of energy that no longer flowed towards him. I feigned a moment's thought, then concurred. He might appreciate a change of surroundings, I offered, as if the primary concern were the landscape. The journey north was without incident, even tranquil. I watched the scenery pass in a blur while my husband spoke sporadically about the cottage, the nearby lake, the barbecue grill on the rear patio that was purportedly ideal for the prevailing weather. I provided nods at regular intervals. The young man occupied the rear seat, his attention directed out the window, one earphone in place. We didn't exchange many glances, yet I sensed each passing mile drawing the distance taut between where we had been and where we were headed. The cottage was unassuming, all exposed wooden beams and plush rugs, with a kitchen that carried the scent of cedar and thyme. My husband deposited his belongings and proclaimed himself weary. He uncorked a bottle of wine and poured 3 servings. I accepted mine and stepped outside while the two of them brought in the groceries. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and a profound quiet. That night, the fire in the hearth crackled with excessive vigor. We sat together in the living area, the 3 of us, wine partially consumed, narratives half recounted. My husband drifted off to sleep early, slumped in the armchair, his chin resting on his chest, the wineglass still clutched in his hand. I rose to gently retrieve it, his fingers relinquished their hold without him stirring. Then I turned. He was observing me again, his expression unreadable. He didn't move, didn't so much as blink, and I didn't avert my gaze. I walked into the kitchen, placed the glass in the sink, and stood with both hands anchored to the edge of the counter. Behind me, I registered the soft creak of floorboards. I didn't turn. When he drew near, the warmth emanating from his body enveloped the space behind me, as if it had always been meant to be there. "This is perilous," I murmured. "No," came the reply. Yet I didn't step away, and neither did he. His fingers brushed against the side of my wrist, barely a touch, yet enough to make my breath catch. We stood in that manner, the low hum of the refrigerator obscuring our quiet, the flickering firelight from the other room dancing behind us. The sound of the armchair shifting did not occur, my husband remained asleep. "We must cease this," I stated, but my voice lacked the requisite resolve. I could hear its weakness. "I made an effort," he whispered. "I tried more earnestly than you realize." I pivoted then, slowly, our faces mere inches from each other. "You believe I didn't?" The stillness fractured. I felt his hand slide to my waist. The touch was delicate, as if awaiting consent. And I granted it, not through words, but by the way I inclined towards him, and how my fingers tightened around his forearm. The kiss was fated. It wasn't hurried. It was hushed, deliberate, more profound than any admission. We had moved beyond refusal now, we were in its reverberation. When it concluded, we didn't utter a word. We stood like figures carved from stone in that dimly lit kitchen, each inhalation a question without a reply. I was the first to pull away, cautiously, unhurriedly, and turned back towards the counter. My hands quivered as I reached for the tap. He departed the room without making a sound. The next morning, my husband prepared eggs and hummed softly to himself. He inquired if we had rested well. I affirmed that we had. I avoided meeting the young man's gaze. The dining area was filled with the clatter of cutlery and desultory conversation. The table separating us felt like a performance space. That afternoon, we strolled around the lake, the 3 of us, yet somehow, always in pairs. Initially, he and I lagged behind while my husband took photographs of the trees. Then, my husband briefly took my hand, and the other walked on ahead. There was an instant by the water's edge where he paused, stooped to retrieve a smooth, flat stone, and sent it skimming across the lake's surface. I observed the concentric circles spread outwards until they were absorbed by the stillness once more. And I found myself pondering if that was what we represented, something fleeting, propelled with force, fated to vanish without leaving a mark. That night, following dinner, my husband again succumbed to sleep early. His son remained outside on the patio, the faint luminescence of his phone visible in the gathering darkness. I stepped out quietly. The air had grown colder now. The stars overhead were sharp, brilliant, and unforgiving. We stood in silence for a considerable time. "I am uncertain of what we are engaged in," I remarked at length. "I believe we are." "I mean, what follows this?" "I don't believe we are meant to ascertain that." I looked at him then, truly looked, not at his features, or his youth, or the effortless way he occupied a space, but at the profound influence he exerted over me. The attraction that had ceased to be mere physical desire long ago. It had evolved into something quieter, something more perilous, a kind of conviction, a reflection I hadn't realized I needed. "Do you regret it?" I inquired again. He shook his head. "Only the part where it must conclude." We stood in the chill until our glasses were empty and the silence no longer felt like evasion. It felt like comprehension. Upon returning inside, I didn't proceed directly to bed. I passed the mirror in the hallway and paused. I scarcely recognized the woman reflected there, not because she had altered, but because she had stepped outside the predetermined role she had inhabited for years: wife, nurturer, observer. Now, she was something entirely different. And for the inaugural occasion, I was unsure whether that prospect filled me with terror or exhilaration. We journeyed back in quietude. 3 individuals contained within the vehicle's hum, each oriented forwards, each privately assessing the significance of what had been relinquished in that rustic dwelling. My husband spoke less than his norm. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel during the extensive stretch of motorway, occasionally glancing at road signs, his mouth set in a firm, inscrutable line. I occupied the passenger seat, my hands clasped in my lap, observing the passing trees as a blur. In the rear seat, he either slept or feigned sleep. The quiet was not foreign. We had experienced this iteration of stillness before, the kind born from weariness and the established patterns of a long-standing marriage. This time, however, it possessed a certain depth, a pressure, as if each of us had become acutely conscious that matters were no longer falling into place as they were intended to. Upon arriving home, I unpacked with mechanical efficiency, folded pullovers, sorted garments, arranged our footwear in the hallway as if such details held importance. I observed the most minute particulars, how his socks were bundled unevenly, how my husband's aroma lingered in the luggage longer than I anticipated. I lit a candle in the living room, vanilla and sandalwood. Something to ground me. He remained in his room for the majority of the day. I understood, without needing to ask, that he wasn't shunning me. It wasn't a withdrawal. It was an acknowledgement that we had traversed a boundary we could no longer disregard. And now, we each required time to sit with the quietude of what we had transformed into. By evening, the atmosphere within the house had grown heavy again, not with overt strain, but with unvoiced inquiries. My husband invited me to join him on the sofa. He poured wine for both of us and silenced the television. "We need to converse," he stated. I waited. My heart did not accelerate, my hands did not quiver. There was no theatrical music, no surge of culpability, just a gradual ache, like pressing on a forgotten bruise. "I've been perceiving something with you." His voice was low, measured, as if he were still attempting to determine the extent of what he truly wished to ascertain. "You're withdrawn, or preoccupied." I held my glass firmly. "Marriage can become quiet," I remarked. He nodded, too readily. "But you're not merely quiet, you're elsewhere." I looked at him then, and for the first time in months, I detected a vulnerability in his expression. Not ire, not mistrust, but something nearer to sorrow, a realization that he had ceased reaching out to me long before anyone else had ever ventured to. You never inquire about my feelings anymore, I stated. You perceive that? He blinked slowly. You always appeared to be fine. I was never fine, I countered. I was merely coping. He swallowed, the muscles in his jaw tensing. Is there another person involved? I didn't reply. Nor did I prevaricate. I averted my gaze, focusing on the rim of the wineglass, the light refracting on its curved surface. He didn't insist. He rose slowly and walked into the kitchen. I remained on the sofa. I braced myself for the customary wave of panic, but it failed to materialize. Only a cold, serene acceptance permeated my being, like ink dispersing in water. That night, I lay awake, listening to his breathing beside me. At some juncture, he had come back to bed, had slipped beneath the covers without making contact, without even brushing against me. The separation between us was merely a few inches, yet it could have been an entire landmass. I stared at the ceiling, cognizant of every heartbeat, every recollection, every boundary we had both tacitly agreed not to breach, until this point. And then, I left the bed. I padded down the hallway, barefoot, each step soft and deliberate, like navigating through mist. I didn't knock. There was no necessity. He opened the door before my hand could reach the handle. He uttered no words. He moved to the side, permitting my entry. I stood in the dim illumination of his room, my arms wrapped around myself, my heart maintaining a steady, slow rhythm. He was attired in a loose t-shirt, gray from wear, soft at the neckline. His hair was slightly damp, as if he had cleansed away the day. We confronted each other in silence. I informed him I wasn't, unclear, likely ignorant. He nodded. I perceived the internal struggle in his eyes. Not apprehension, not culpability, but an inquiry he didn't know how to articulate. I no longer wish to deceive, I added. He didn't move towards me. He didn't reach out. He simply waited. And in that quietude, I felt more embraced than I had in months. Do you desire for me to cease? He inquired, his voice subdued. I contemplated it. Truly contemplated. No. I stated, I desire for you to cease feigning that this is merely a fleeting situation. He exhaled. Not with relief, not with surprise. Something more substantial. I moved nearer, not out of impulsiveness, but with lucidity. Every fiber of my being felt as though it had been reset to a different cadence, one that responded solely to nearness, to breath shared in dimly lit spaces, to the security of being desired in quietude. We didn't exchange a kiss. Not on that occasion. He touched my arm, then my shoulder. His thumb traced the contour of my jawline. I closed my eyes, and for the inaugural occasion, I didn't feel compelled to submerge myself in another's wanting. I could simply be. I returned to my room just prior to sunrise. My husband was still asleep, his back oriented towards my side of the bed. I lay down, eyes open, breath even, my body still resonating from something more subdued than physical intimacy yet more resonant than memory. And I comprehended that the gravest aspect wasn't the falsehood. The gravest aspect was that I had ceased anticipating being discovered, because I had already relinquished myself. The days that ensued flowed like water escaping cupped hands, unhurried initially, then impossible to retain. Nothing altered in a discernible manner. We continued to share meals. My husband still left his footwear by the entrance. Still inquired if I required anything from the market. Still discussed the forthcoming business quarter as if it held genuine significance. We navigated around one another like courteous strangers sharing the same living area, connected by custom and quietude. Yet, beneath the surface, everything had transformed. I ceased feigning ignorance of the anticipated footsteps outside my door late into the night. I stopped deluding myself that I hadn't perceived the alteration in his posture when near me, closer, more audacious, even amidst the everyday disarray of our lives. And I refrained from posing questions to which I already possessed the answers. The ultimate severance didn't arrive with vociferous accusations or acts of betrayal. There was no intercepted communication, no dramatic confrontation under stark illumination, merely a tranquil morning, overcast and still, when my husband stood in the doorway, a packed travel bag at his feet and a folded shirt in his hands. He held it for a lengthy moment before placing it gently on the sofa's armrest. "I am going to reside at my brother's for a period," he stated. I stood at the kitchen counter, the rim of a coffee mug still radiating warmth beneath my fingers. I didn't immediately turn to confront him. I required a moment, perhaps two, to navigate the wave of insensibility that struck my chest. Not sorrow, not remorse, just the unarticulated understanding that what had been tenuously held together was at last, quietly, being released. "I didn't desire this," I uttered, my voice fragile, parched. "Not in this manner." He nodded once. "I trust you." The bag emitted a soft sound as he lifted it, the zipper brushing against his trouser leg. He didn't forcefully close the door. He didn't demand an explanation. And I didn't provide the unvarnished truth. I suspect a part of him had been aware for a longer duration than I had. Not the specifics. Never the specifics, but the void. He had perceived the why of that void long before either of us possessed the fortitude to give it a name. After the vehicle departed from the driveway, I remained at the window for a considerable time. The sun had not yet penetrated the cloud cover. The trees were almost motionless. Even the birds seemed to register the alteration in the atmosphere. Behind me, the silence was more profound than ever. He didn't descend the stairs immediately. I pictured him pacing, pausing, perhaps listening. I didn't summon him. I remained still. When he finally materialized in the kitchen entrance, his expression held no triumph. No hint of ownership or victory, only a sense of reluctance. Prudence. I poured him coffee. He accepted it with a simple nod. We sat opposite each other at the small table. Two individuals encircled by walls that had harbored too many confidences, too much yearning, too much quiet. "I didn't wish for this to transpire in this way," he remarked after a prolonged silence. "I am aware. I didn't come here with the intention of taking something from him." "I don't believe you did." He looked down at his hands, then at me. "But I will not offer an apology for desiring you." That statement hung between us like something hallowed. I allowed it to remain, not because I disbelieved it, but because I required time to fully process the gravity of its meaning. To want someone was one matter, to remain with them after the ensuing fallout, after the pivotal decision, was an entirely different proposition. That evening, he prepared supper. Nothing elaborate, just pasta with garlic and lemon. Yet it imbued the house with a sense of warmth. I observed him moving about the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, a dishcloth slung over one shoulder. It was such an ordinary tableau that it felt almost dreamlike, the way domesticity abruptly appeared altered when viewed through the lens of newfound closeness. After we concluded our meal, we didn't withdraw to our respective rooms. We lingered in the living area. Lights dimmed, music emanating from the corner speaker. Not overtly romantic music, not seductive, just gentle piano melodies. Something ambient that allowed for spaces between the notes. He sat near me on the sofa, not touching, not pressing, just present. Available in a manner that felt entirely unlike anything I had previously experienced. "I don't anticipate that you know what follows," he stated. "I don't," I conceded. He turned his head, his gaze unwavering. "Do you wish to navigate it alongside me?" The directness of the inquiry resonated deeply within me, for it wasn't a commitment or a snare, it was simply a proposition. One that had been quietly forming in the recesses of all we had shared, every glance, every almost touch, every kiss that felt more like an admission than an error. I didn't respond with spoken words. I leaned towards him, resting my head upon his shoulder. His arm encircled me without a moment's pause. We remained in that position until the music ceased, until the air grew cool, until the silence no longer harbored tension, but a sense of tranquility. Later, in bed, I lay awake once more, not with uncertainty, not with apprehension, just a quiet, unyielding consciousness that I was no longer the same individual who had retired to sleep beside her husband. A mere fortnight ago, I was a transformed person now, somewhat unrecognizable to the facet of myself that had equated emotional numbness with steadiness. I was unsure of the path ahead, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel as though I were slowly vanishing.